It is a pleasure to be here. I bring my greetings from Gymea Baps, who have loaned me out, I suppose it is probably the best way to describe it. I was reflecting a little bit about this during the week. I have been at Gymea Baptist Church since the beginning of 1997, where I followed one Neil Dawson as a youth pastor. So I got to come to a place where he had been. I never met him for years and years and years and years. So it only seems appropriate that now that Neil has moved on, that I would be here. It seems to be my lot in life. So I'm keeping an eye on where he ends up next, because that's probably where I'll be eventually. So we want to take some time over the next 3 weeks to have a look at the Gospel of Mark. And as you can imagine, dealing with an entire Gospel in just 3 weeks means that you need to make some fairly significant decisions about which bits you're going to look at and which bits you're not. And so I've made the decision, really, which was very gracious on James's behalf. And we're going to look at this section, chapter 1, verses 1 to 15, Mark 8, verses 27 to 38, I believe it is, and Mark chapter 13. The second passage is when Peter confesses who Jesus is, and the third passage is when Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple. Because I believe in all three of these passages, we learn something very important about who Jesus is and what it means to follow him. And that is Mark's primary concern for us. He wasn't just jotting down history. He wasn't just taking notes. He actually had a fairly significant purpose for why he was writing. And I think it's really crucial for us to capture that same meaning. One of the things that I delight about the Bible is how beautifully it's been told. We tend to miss it. I think we kind of Sunday schoolize the Bible a bit and assume it's a bunch of stories for children. It's appropriate to teach our children the stories, but the stories tend to have more depth and complexity than we can handle in 15 minutes with a craft. And so it's important that we take seriously what's going on here in Mark's Gospel and what it is that he's actually trying to do. Have you ever watched a movie and missed the first 5 minutes? And then spent the rest of the time either doing the commercials, trying to find out what's going on, or if you're by yourself, trying to figure out what's going on. A number of years ago, I was flying back, I think from visiting my family overseas, and I missed the first couple of minutes of the Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind with Jim Carrey and Kate Winslet. And if you've seen the movie, you'll know that doesn't matter how much of the introduction you've seen or missed, you still won't make any sense of the movie. But I didn't know that. And so I had missed, 3-4 minutes, and man, I spent the next hour and a half completely lost as to what was going on, trying to piece together what I was sure I had missed out in the introduction. You've had that experience before. You missed the first section of a television show or whatever it is, and you're just lost. We need to make sure that we understand Mark's introduction here, because these first 15 verses are an introduction. They're not a preface or a kind of a preamble or a foreword that nobody ever reads. This is an introduction. And he introduces for us the primary themes that he is concerned with, the things that he wants to then explore over the course of the next 15 or 16 chapters. Part of our dilemma when we read Mark's introduction is that it is so brief. It's kind of one of the hallmarks of his telling. He tends to tell things with an economy of language. And so when we read about his baptism here, or we read about his temptation in the wilderness, we immediately think of the other gospel accounts where it's a little lengthier, where we have the interaction that Jesus has with Satan in the wilderness, for instance, or the interaction that Jesus has with John the Baptist on the shores of the Jordan River. And we kind of think, this is just a really brief introduction. Yeah, we know all that stuff. But Mark did not assume that we knew Matthew, Luke, and John. So this is what he needs to tell us about who Jesus is, because that's what he's on about. And the picture that he gives us about Jesus is an extraordinary one. Now, we tend to miss it, because we treat it as kind of a preface, and then we kind of get to the good stuff when Jesus gets to Capernaum and starts healing people and all that good stuff. But we need to recognize just what a tremendous portrait Mark paints for us. And it begins in the very first line. And I'm not even talking about the fact when he describes Jesus as the Messiah or the Christ or as the Son of God. It's actually in these first 4 words, the beginning 5 words, of the good news. In Mark's day and age, It was in the Roman imperial age that had been inaugurated by Caesar Augustus. And Caesar Augustus, by this point on, about 50 years on, he was seen by many as a divine being. He had already died at this point in time. But his life and his rule was seen as a tremendous benefit to humanity. They've actually recovered an inscription from Asia Minor, first kind of Turkey nowadays, where they described Caesar's reign as being given to humanity by the gods themselves, in order that he might make wars to cease and to bring peace and prosperity to all. His life was considered so tremendous that there was no hope of any future generation ever managing to do even half of what he had done. And his birth as Savior to the world was described as the beginning of good news for humanity. Mark begins by saying, not Caesar, Jesus. For all the peace and all the prosperity and all the security that Caesar Augustus has brought, Jesus is even better. The beginning of the good news. And then, of course, he tells us that this is the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then in the second verse there, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. Now again, we read that and we just kind of go, yeah, it's the Bible, of course, as it was written. They talk about that all the time. But do you realize that this means that Jesus is the Son of destiny? That he is the chosen one? That you've read stories and seen movies about chosen ones? The destined ones? Anakin Skywalker, Neo from the Matrix, or Harry Potter, right? They're the chosen ones. They're the destined ones, and we expect great things from them. There are prophetic destinies on their lives that they simply cannot escape. They are not ordinary people like you and I. They are extraordinary people. Those marked apart by God himself, in this case, to do extraordinary things. For 700 years, the Jews had been waiting for the chosen one, for the one of destiny to arrive, as it has been written in the prophet Isaiah. I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. And so John the Baptist appears. Here is the ultimate warm-up act. Because that's all John is, isn't it? He's the one to warm up the crowds, to kind of get people kind of all hyped up before the real show begins in Jesus. And John, the first legitimate prophetic voice in hundreds of years, just bursts onto the scene, doesn't he? But from the very beginning, what is his ministry? To prepare the way for the Lord. Did you hear that? Prepare the way for the Lord. This is the warm-up for the arrival of God himself, which is, of course, why the entire countryside and the entire population of Jerusalem come to see John. If I could prove to you, and I don't know why you would believe me, never believe anyone who says this to you, but if I could prove to you that Jesus were coming tomorrow, right? If I could give you rock solid guarantees that he was coming tomorrow, how would that change what you do this afternoon? If you knew that Jesus was coming back tomorrow, what might you do today? Well, it might be time to kind of polish up your soul a little bit, mightn't it? Spend a little bit more time in prayer, read those tricky bits you haven't got to yet, because we're nearly out of time and there might be a quiz, right? You want to kind of make sure you're on right terms with those around you and all that. Isn't that what John the Baptist is doing? God is coming. Who wants to get ready? And the whole Judean wilderness, the whole Judean kind of countryside came to him to say, yes, I want to be ready for when the Lord comes. And so they confessed their sins and were baptized in the Jordan, as Alex was baptized today, baptized in the Jordan in order that they might be prepared and ready for the coming of the Lord. Do you see how big this is? This is massive. Mark begins by saying, bigger than Caesar, 700 years of prophecy waiting to be fulfilled in this one man who arrives behind this legitimate prophetic voice, crying out in the wilderness, preparing the way for the Lord. And did you hear how John describes Jesus? There is one coming after me who is more powerful than I, the thongs of whose sandals I'm not worthy to stoop down and untie. John, the first legitimate prophetic voice in 400 years, says, as great as I may be, and he was great, as great as I may be, if there were a job opening to be the bloke who untied his shoes at the end of the day, I would not bother applying because I am not up to it. And so Jesus comes from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And as he is baptized, did you hear the things that took place? They're extraordinary things. I mean, it's always wonderful when someone's baptized, but heaven wasn't torn open when Alex came out of the water. I didn't notice it if it did. Is it still raining? Right? That didn't happen, did it? The heavens were not torn open. I didn't hear an audible voice. I didn't see the Spirit descend on him like a dove. None of that happened, but here it happens for Jesus. The heavens are torn apart. Mark uses the same verb later on when he talks about the curtain in the temple being torn apart. It's the same verb that's actually used in the Greek Old Testament in Isaiah chapter 61, when the prophet speaks about God rending the heavens and coming down. This is an eschatological sign. It's a sign of the new age to come, the age in which God himself will reign and rule on the earth. For the Spirit to be poured out was similarly a sign of the new age, the age to come, when God's reign and God's rule would be established. Remember at the Pentecost? When Peter preaches, what is the passage that he uses to explain what has taken place? Joel 2. In that day I will pour out my Spirit. He says, so this shouldn't surprise you, he says. This is exactly what we should expect at the new age. And the voice of God, this is my Son, whom I love. This is language that's a royal motif. When God made his promise to David that he would always have a descendant on the throne, God talked about the fact that I will love your son as my own son. In Psalm chapter 2, it talks about the relationship between God and his king. This is the introduction that we're given to Jesus. And then immediately the Spirit sends him into the wilderness where he is tested for 40 days. Now this is a beginning much like that of the people of Israel, isn't it? Where they are also taken into the wilderness, where they also experience temptation, and yet every time that they faced temptation, what happened? They fell over, didn't they? It didn't matter what the testing was, they seemed to always take the path of least trust in God. But what do we find with Jesus? No, he succeeds where Israel failed. He is, in a large degree, the new Israel. That's how Mark is presenting him. He is presenting him as the beginning, almost the beginning of the Bible again, saying, here's another chance for this all to be done properly. Do you see how big this is? So when Jesus shows up and he begins his public ministry by saying, the time has come, what do we expect? Or rather, what should we expect? Because we know the story too well to expect anything anymore, right? But if you've read this for the first time, what would you expect? Not what you find. Wouldn't you expect the entire countryside rising to greet him? Wouldn't you expect the palm branch thing of Palm Sunday right now? That the robes on the horses and the men with their swords and their shields and the spears and everyone kind of gathering around Jesus going, this is fantastic, bring it on, Lord. Isn't that what you expect? Tremendous crowds of people proclaiming and declaring that Jesus is Lord, that